Dear listeners and viewers of Khabarhub and Radio Candid, Namaste, good afternoon. Welcome to the very special interview with Dr. Lisette Odgaard. Dr. Lisette Odgaard is a non-resident senior fellow at Hudson Institute and senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute of Defense Studies. She has been a visiting scholar at institutions such as Harvard University, the Wilson Center, and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. She is also the author of numerous monographs, books, peer-reviewed articles, and research papers on Chinese and Indo-Pacific security, and she is a frequent commentator on these issues in the media. Dr. Odgaard's recent publications include Europeans' engagement in the Indo-Pacific, the interplay between institutions and state-level Navy diplomacy, published by Asia Policy in October 2019, Europe's place in Sino-US competition in S. J. Tellis, Elysian Sazwiski, and Michael Willis' edited book, Strategic Asia 2020, Sino-US Competition for Global Influence, Settle NBR. Today we'll be discussing Europe's role in the Indo-Pacific with Dr. Odgaard. Dr. Odgaard, welcome to our show. The first question for today is, the European Union has finally put together a long-awaited strategy on the Indo-Pacific. What are the reasons for the European Union to step into the region, and what are the major goals of this strategy?
Well, Europe and the European Union has in fact had a sort of presence in the Indo-Pacific for a while in different areas. So the main strength of the European Union is its trade, power over trade, where it has a lot of decision-making power in relation to the member states. And it has had free trade agreements and pursued more free trade agreements for a couple of years. And so in an economic sense, the EU is already a significant actor in the Indo-Pacific. Security-wise, it's much more difficult for the EU to establish a footprint because it has less power over the member states. Because there are all these areas where the European Union cannot really take decisions of its own, today it often works in this way. A number of countries which wants to move forward with some policy area, such as, playing a security military role in the Indo-Pacific, will move forward. And of course, there will be informal discussions within the European institutions about this. And to do such a thing, the main powers will usually have to be part of it. So in the case of naval diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, France took the lead together with then member of the European Union, the United Kingdom, in establishing a military footprint in the Indo-Pacific. And that has slowly been built up, and now countries such as Germany and the Netherlands also form part of this effort. And this is where the European Union then, publishes a strategy endorsing and recognizing that this is important, and the European Union will establish mechanisms in support of this sort of effort on the part of individual member states. And that's also what it says in the strategy. If you read it, for example, the European Union has a counter-piracy naval force that's called Operation Atalanta, and it plans to organize more joint exercises and port calls between Indo-Pacific naval units and this naval force. And it will also encourage increased participation of partners in EU military and civilian common security and defense policy missions. It will aim to expand its security and defense dialogue to include more partners and engage more strongly with the ASEAN Regional Forum, etc. So the EU will in various ways, be supportive of the efforts of individual countries, and that's significant. In the area of trade, the European Union has just announced that it wants to have relations with the Quad countries, which is an important security grouping on subjects of common interest, such as technology, vaccines, climate change, areas where the European Union is an important actor globally as well. So in this way, it is very significant, and it's been a long time coming. It's a process that has developed since 2014, really, and then is coming to a new stage now.
Thank you, Dr. Odgaard. Dr. Odgaard, does this new strategy signal a seismic shift from an older understanding of the Asia-Pacific to the evolving doctrine of the Indo-Pacific? And what repercussions will it have on the Indo-Pacific policymakers?
I don't think it's a seismic shift because, as I just described, it's been a great gradual process. The seismic shift for the European Union, there's been a couple. Of course, there is Brexit, and Lex Brexit for the EU member states is that even if they have disagreements, they understand that, they have to act together to have a European influence in an era of US-China competition. It is necessary for the countries to act together despite their differences. And so it has had, no country wants to go down the route of the United Kingdom, not even those that are quite, difficult in the media and public, like Hungary, for example, challenging the European Union. That doesn't mean they want to leave. No country wants to leave because they understand that they need the union to exercise influence. So that's a seismic shift. And that's also why the European Union operates in a different way today, which I just described, where some countries start an effort, and then once that, and that's of course based on negotiations between the countries, and the European Union brings the countries together in the council and other places so they can sort of coordinate what they're doing. And then the EU will plan to establish mechanisms that supports these efforts, and they will be launched once it's sort of gotten off the ground and major countries are on board, such as Germany, which took a while to become part of this effort, is now, it's a big thing for Germany to send a warship to the Indo-Pacific, even if it doesn't change the actual situation on the ground that much. The signal that Europe, it has a presence, that they have a view on what goes on in the South China Sea, that, for example, that they're willing to pursue, is important. And that's not EU policy, because there you only have these general policy statements, because some countries doesn't want to make a big move in the Indo-Pacific. But still, this is very much seen as a European effort once the major countries are on board, and that's significant, but it's been a gradual process.
Dr. Odgaard, did the Biden administration really fail to consult its allies over the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Do you think the growing argument on creating a new separate European Union military force is necessary after what happened in Afghanistan?
I think Afghanistan, of course, it's important for the regional situation and for Afghanistan, but I don't think it will tell us much about European-US relations and the state within NATO, because I think NATO in general and the member states recognize that there are other issues that they need to pay attention to militarily. And so I don't even if there's a lot of criticism about the way in which, the US withdrawal didn't hear their allies, etc., I don't think it will be a key issue for the alliance. There are other more important issues in their view that will affect it. And so the Chinese and the Russian, challenges to the US and Europe are considered, the main issues on the agenda. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan is to, redirect resources towards addressing those challenges. And I don't think there's much disagreement that that was a necessary move. So I don't think it will say much about whether Europe and the US can cooperate and whether they can do it in a way that provides credible deterrence against Russia and China.
Dr. Odgaard, as Russia and Belarus formally opened a week-long vast joint military drills across the territory of both countries and in the Baltic Sea, how have the NATO countries been responding to this development, especially at the time of heightened tension between the West and Belarus due to a crackdown on the opposition?
Of course, this is a major concern for Europe and for the US, but there is this issue that for China, or for the United States, China is threat number one. And then Russia may be threat number two, whereas for Europe, the sort of hard power use by Russia is threat number one, and China is then number two. So there is a sort of, geographical difference between their security and military priorities. That hasn't yet been, really a problem on the ground in NATO, because US contributes as much as it always has, by and large, especially if you count US contributions to bilateral NATO projects, then it's as active as ever in Eastern Europe. But down the road, the US will most likely redirect more of its resources towards the Indo-Pacific. And then some voices argue that Europe should have more of a role in deterring Russia and in taking on that challenge. It remains to be seen if that actually happens, because the downside to that is that, Europe and the US will then start, in a way, disintegrating their force structures and, their capabilities potentially. And I'm not sure that that's desirable for NATO. So while that's on the table, it may not, come to play out in that way, because it has disadvantages also to have, to have different priorities in terms of deterrence. So we'll see.
Dr. Odgaard, you just mentioned that China is threat number one. So how has China's opacity in nuclear policy and its nuclear ambiguity affected the strategic landscape in the region?
Well, of course, China is becoming, whereas long it wasn't really a nuclear or seen as a threat with regard to its nuclear posture, save for with regard to Taiwan, it is becoming, a threat in that field also. That will mainly, I think, we've already seen the US responding to that in terms of its strategy, its acquisition plans, its plans for deployments, etc. But I don't think Europe is prepared to go down that route yet. It's also not been entirely happy with all of the US responses. So again, it has been a cause of debate as to what the response to this should be. And I don't think that debate is finished yet. So again, I would say the US is pretty clear on, making that a major issue of its strategy and its deployments. But in the case of Europe, I think their response will take longer to come for that, and it may be one of the areas where the US will play a role, but Europe will not. Individual European countries will play less of a role, if any.
Couple of months back, China has imposed sanctions on European NGOs, academicians, and think tanks, including several members of European Parliament. Considering this development, do you think that China is losing Europe? Has Beijing failed in crafting its Europe policy?
Well, it had quite severe consequences because prior to this Chinese action, Europe and China had agreed on this comprehensive bilateral investment treaty, and that was seen as a victory for China in the sense that they wanted to demonstrate that they could, forge agreements with Western countries where they took into account their concerns. And for the European Union, it was going to be a test of whether China would take seriously the concerns of Europe, which is shared by the US, about Chinese intellectual property theft, huge state subsidies to companies that then compete on unfair terms in the global markets, all these breaches of World Trade Organization rules that both Europe and the US are very concerned about. But of course, because China chose to adopt these sanctions against European institutions within the European Union countries, etc., that treaty was scrapped. And so China's chance to demonstrate that it would voluntarily try to compromise with Western views on how to behave in the international economic and financial system was lost. I think that was a very unwise decision on the part of China, and that the treaty is not going to be revived anytime soon now, and it sort of pushed Europe closer towards the hard line which the US has taken. So that was an unfortunate move if China was hoping to get Europe to agree that we have to, we can work on this in a sort of diplomatic way. We can solve our problems diplomatically and politically. We don't have to use the heavy-handed measures that the US does, etc. That was kind of not good. So China would have to do something to demonstrate that Europe and the US should go down that route. Otherwise, I think Europe too will have to, rely more on the sort of deterrence and defense measures that the European Union has already started to construct to defend themselves against, China's theft, etc.
What do you have to say about the competing strategic vision of China and Russia in the Arctic region? How can the long-term strategic balance in the Arctic be understood?
Well, I think Russia and China plays quite different roles in the Arctic, because Russia is, it's a resident power. It's a major Arctic nation, and for that reason, it's got lots of, legitimate interests and, a natural role to play, if you like. So Russia has to be, dealt with. Here in Norway, what has happened is that Norway has accepted much closer military relations with the United States, and there is, a military buildup in response to the Russian military buildup in the Arctic, which cannot just be seen as, Russia wanting to patrol the maritime areas where it has jurisdiction, etc. It is a military buildup that is directed against the US homeland also, clearly. And Russia is constantly testing NATO's ability to counter military threats from Russia. That's sort of a day-to-day thing that NATO countries and partners have to deal with in the Arctic. And Norway has responded by moving militarily much closer to the United States, which will now have most likely bases, etc., here in Norway. But at the same time, Norway has a lot of cooperation with Russia, their neighboring states, and there's a lot of interaction in the Arctic part of Norway and Russia between the countries, research, education, trade. And I think that's, in a way, the way things are heading. So, while deterring Russia militarily, there's also efforts to demonstrate that we still have to work with Russia. And the US is also trying to go down that route. China is not a military power in the Arctic. And although it has made great efforts to have a strategic presence in the Arctic, getting a foot into controlling or exploiting natural resources, strategic resources, also trying to buy, acquire, for example, scrapped military bases. It has often been prevented from doing so. It hasn't complained too much about that because at the end of the day, the Arctic is not high on the list of priority for China. It works closer and closer with Russia because a lot of the other Arctic nations are less favorable to China's engagement, especially in later years, which sort of encourages China to work much closer with Russia. But Russia is also skeptical of China. It doesn't want China to be have a major Arctic presence, and so they don't always agree. And Russia takes care to work with other nations such as France and Japan on strategic resources such as liquefied natural gas. So I think they work together in areas of common interest, but there's a limit to how far that cooperation will go. And I don't see China becoming a military power in the near future in the Arctic because they simply have too many other concerns for that to be a priority. Now also with Afghanistan, as you mentioned, they're going to have to take that seriously, also in a military sense, because it's in their backyard. And they will have to now, they'll of course try to manage it primarily with economic and political diplomatic means, but they will have to also build a military capability that's able to handle major instability in that part of the world. So in the big picture, China has other things to be concerned about. And so militarily, I don't see them playing they'll of course explore things, but that's different from planning a presence.
Dr. Liselotte Odgaard, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.